On episode 50, I outlined how I'd like to take the future direction of this podcast's content towards what I believe are the two biggest global topics that will define the next 20 years, if not more, for society and humanity. And those are cryptocurrency and the climate crisis. Since episode 50, things have been heavy on crypto and less so on the climate crisis. Well, it's time we discuss the climate, and I couldn't think of a better guest than Vanessa Taveras Dalmau. Vanessa hails from the Dominican Republic and currently lives in Australia. She has a master's of environmental science that specializes in climate change adaptation, and she's currently completing her PhD. Her PhD research uses systems thinking to explore how we can incorporate the sustainable development goals into the tourism industry and transition from sustainable to regenerative tourism. On this episode, we explore the climate crisis and touch upon how government and politics, corporations and big business, nonprofits and for-profits, and we as individuals all play an active role in the past, present, and future of this planet that we all call home. I'm Jarrett Carpenter, and this is Wi-Fi and Water. Vanessa, welcome to Wi-Fi and Water. How you doing?
I'm good, Jarrett. Thanks so much for having me.
Tell me about life. This is the second time that I've actually connected with someone in Australia. And I just think it's kind of cool that you are literally on the other side of the world. And for the conversation we're going to have today is going to be focused on climate, the environment, sustainability, and probably travel and tourism. So talk to me about where you are these days in your life. I know you're doing your PhD. Tell us about who you are and what you're up to.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm actually Dominican. I was born in the Dominican Republic in the lovely Caribbean region. And I moved to Australia in 2011. To do my Bachelor of Environmental Science. Before that, I was working with an NGO called 350 that does international climate change advocacy, specifically working with communities to kind of build grassroots movements to, advocate or lobby the government to do more for climate change, pretty much. So I moved here to continue kind of building capacity and my knowledge and skills in that area, and then ended up staying here. So that was 12 years ago, which is crazy to think about. And since then, I've been working so my career kind of transitioned from climate change. I did my master's in climate change adaptation, but professionally, I've been working in the sustainability space for the last 6 years, specifically within a business context. So looking at how businesses can use sustainability to extract not just value in terms of return on investment and all that, but also provide benefits to society and communities through their business. And more recently, I have also been working with sustainability within the tourism industry. My master's thesis looked at ecotourism and its capacity to mitigate poaching in a marine protected area. And now I'm doing my PhD on regenerative tourism and just understanding, what is regenerative tourism? What does it look like in practice? And what benefits can it bring to people, planets, and prosperity as well? So economic as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, you've been busy and you have, I'm assuming, a lot of work to do when you look forward into the future with climate and everything that has to do with climate. And I had actually posted yesterday, because I got into your Instagram, and we can shout that at the end. I posted a picture that I thought was interesting because it says, what do you find most challenging about implementing your sustainability plan, policy, or initiative? Because it kind of goes to what you're talking about, working with businesses and building also the return on investment, not just from a monetary standpoint, from this is good for humans and it's good for our planet. So it's something that your company should want to invest in. And it says, I feel like these are probably the four pillars or the four things that you always run into, the obstacles. And it says operational issues, expense related, guest issues, or time constraints. And is this focused just on tourism, or do you think that these are obstacles that any for-profit company has when they're trying to wrap their mind around how to be more, I don't want to say sustainable, because I think that word, we could talk about that word after, but be better for the planet?
Specifically, obviously, with guest issues is specifically for a tourism context, because, if you're a beauty company, for instance, you don't have guests, you have customers, but it is transferable across different industries. And this is something that I've seen, that I've come across when businesses are, it depends on the journey where they're at as well. And I think that, before we kind of get into all these different obstacles, the company itself, whether it's through their mission, whether it's through their own organizational culture, they will have some kind of understanding of where they're at in a, if you want to call it, a sustainability spectrum. So a lot of companies have, they start very early and they're only looking at social responsibility. And then as you move along the spectrum, you have companies that are, sustainable. And then at the farthest end, you have companies that are regenerative. And depending on where you're at in that journey as a business or as a company, you will have different obstacles. So if a company or a client that I want to work with has never heard of sustainability, then their obstacles are going to be different than someone that has already kind of started implementing it in practice. And it varies according to the company. So some will say, sustainability is too expensive. And that is a misconception. That is probably the most popular, for lack of a better word, that they just think that sustainability is expensive. And yeah, it can be if you're engaging a consultant or if you want to launch a particular project, but the return on investment that you get from that can be quite significant. And we're already seeing, I think it was Walmart that I'm not sure if this is sustainable, but what they did was they decided to make their receipts shorter to save on paper. And they ended up saving like billions of dollars. Obviously, Walmart is a huge company. So yeah, I guess it depends on the company, what they value and where they're at. The obstacles will be different for each one.
The money is the conversation, right? And we had spoken before about how in your business, you focusing like when you have your climate hat on, it's different from when you have your business hat on because these are two separate things. And so now for you as a business owner, because you do run INTEGO Travel, how are you, and this is really kind of meta because I'm asking you as a sustainability consultant, how you're incorporating these practices into your own business, but how are you leading by example in your own business when you think about these obstacles, when you think about operational issues, the money or the expense related, when you think about your clients or the guests or the end consumer, and then the time constraints, actually, and if you could talk more on the time constraints, that's one maybe I don't understand. So how you're kind of incorporating all those things. And once again, I understand this is a very meta question, but yeah, hopefully you can roll with it.
Well, to be honest, first of all, for me personally, like INTEGO Travel right now, it's kind of, I've just framed it more so as a website where I help people understand what sustainable tourism looks like in practice. And I think the reason why I established that website was more so that I could also share my own perspective as I go through the PhD process, where I'm learning, about what this looks like in practice. So at the moment, I do have a separate arm to the INTEGO group, if you want to call it that, where I do consulting. And I'm in the process of building my own consulting business that's called INTEGO Consulting. And I guess because I'm so new in the process, I don't have an office, for instance. So I do every work that I do is from here, from my house. And, I have a 25 solar panel array system in my roof. So the operations of my business and of me as, Vanessa as a consultant are actually quite minimal. I do try to have most of my meetings virtually so that I don't have to have, travel to client businesses and all that. But I think that, I don't know, I guess for me personally, I think that that's probably a question that I would be able to better answer when I'm more established, because right now I'm really in the early stages of it.
I think it's interesting you say though that, you as a consultant, Vanessa as a consultant is essentially Vanessa with her laptop in her home or at a cafe. But I wonder, is that a conversation that's happening right now in the kind of earth-friendly spaces, that working from home may actually be the best use of resources rather than us getting in cars? And at least in the United States, and once again, this is a very United States metric, but I think the average commute for someone in the United States is 30 minutes each way. So there's 30 minutes of probably burning fossil fuels one way, 30 minutes of burning fossil fuels on the way back. Then you have the extra AC or the heating of the building. I'm assuming that working from home is actually a fairly green decision.
100%. And this is something that has completely been revolutionized through the pandemic because we had been forced essentially to work from home. And, if you look at the literature, there's been so many studies done about the benefit of this, not just in terms of the environment, but also in terms of, our mental well-being, our health, our capacity to relate to our family and all that, which is all part of sustainability. I think that some people have a misconception as well, that when you talk about sustainability, it's about, let's go hug a tree. And it's all about, environment. And no, there's different pillars to sustainability, and one of which is social. And so working from home allows you the opportunity to do that, to not only reduce your footprint in terms of, as you said, commuting to work, from and to work, but also just, just having that balance, that work-life balance. Like, I'm working from home today and my commute was from my bed to my home office, which is fantastic.
You're touching upon something about, and this is something I read on your LinkedIn that was very interesting to me. And probably the reason why I was like, hey, do you want to come on the podcast? Was these two words. Well, I guess three words. Talk to me about climate change adaptation, because that to me is like, it was those three words, because that's something that I constantly think about. And those are the kind of conversations I'm really excited to have here on the pod, because I think that they're things that we as humans, as individuals, and then collectively need to keep in the forefront of our mind. And so for you, that's constantly in and around this, what are the conversations and how does this look for you in Australia? How is that different from the Dominican Republic, et cetera, et cetera?
Climate change adaptation, looking back at my career over the last 12 years, when I started getting involved in the climate advocacy, international climate policy arena, which, there's the conference of the parties every year where governments come together and agree on an agreement on whether it's legally binding or not, on how much temperature or what's the limit for us in terms of how much climate we're willing to brunt, like in terms of degrees, right? So I think that the conversation has changed. Before, it was all about climate mitigation, which essentially means, minimizing the impacts of climate. And that's still really important because if you don't do mitigation, then the extent or the efficacy of your adaptation strategies will also be impacted. So there's two different kind of conversations when it comes to adaptation. There's the mitigation side and then the adaptation side. And the reason why the conversation has shifted more so now is because we've realized that it's too late, in terms of for mitigation. Whatever we do now, the world could shut down tomorrow and we're still going to have climate impacts into the future because we've changed the system so much and we've crossed so many planetary boundaries across these different really key areas, whether it's biodiversity laws, ocean, forests, mountains, etc. All of our ecosystems are being impacted. And so adaptation is particularly important because it helps us understand what is the extent to which that we need to act in order to adapt to these changes. And for instance, in the Dominican Republic, a lot of the adaptation conversation is about sea level rise, for instance, and the impact that that's going to have on communities, especially because most of our population lives on the coast. So adaptation is, just talking about and implementing, what are the strategies that we're going to do to try and help people manage the impacts of climate change into the future. And through my master's, that's what I was learning. What are some of the strategies that we can implement in Australia? Obviously, it's different here. We have a lot of things with droughts, for instance. So it's about, how can we increase the resilience of our communities here in Australia to cope with droughts or cope with floods, for instance. This year has been a La Nina year, and there's been massive amounts of flooding across Southeast Queensland and North Queensland as well. So adaptation is about that. How can we increase the resilience of these communities so that they can survive into the future and adapt to these changes, which are coming inevitably? And even though there is the technology for us to mitigate climate change and adapt to it more quickly, I think there's a lot to be said about the political will to take up these these initiatives and these strategies that are going to set us into a path towards a more sustainable and manageable future.
I think I heard, and please correct me, because this is something I believe it was on a Vice. I watch Vice a lot. I think that they do really out of the box journalism. I believe it's 30 years that if we stopped full stop tomorrow, we said, we're not burning any more fossil fuels. I believe it was that the earth is still going to heat for like 30 more years into the future, no matter what we do, before it naturally then starts to dissipate. And I think if that's numbers true, and please correct me on the number, but even if it were a year, it would be very, very hard for the critics not to win. The critics, meaning people that are denying climate change, the fossil fuel companies that have it in their interest for us to continue to burn fossil fuels, because that's like, if we say, yeah, if we stop burning fossil fuels, we're going to fix the planet, for just to make it super simple, but then it continues to heat no matter what we do, even though we've changed our habits. That's got to be really difficult. Is that at all accurate, that number? And how do you as a climate, I'm going to call a climate scientist, I don't know if that's accurate yet, but how do you as a climate scientist or a client, you will be a doctor, you'll have your doctorate in this. How do you engage with people when this comes up? Because that seems like it would be very, very difficult. For example, if I'm a smoker and you're my doctor and you say, hey, you know what, you need to cut back on cigarettes, right? We just looked at your lungs, like your lung capacity isn't great. The second I stop smoking, I'm assuming that within 6 months, I would feel drastically different. But if I were to stop smoking and then for the next 5 years, I actually got worse, there'd be less incentive for me to kick nicotine. So how do you possibly engage with that with somebody who's, with that more, this is more of a psychological dilemma.
Yes, you're correct. Like, even if it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about even if we shut down our entire economic system, even if humans, let's go even more radical, even if humans just completely disappeared from the face of the planet, we're still going to have these impacts because we've changed things too much. We've crossed tipping points across different ecosystems. Obviously, nature has, it's nature is regenerating in itself. The nature of nature is to be regenerative. So they will, nature itself and the planet will be able to regenerate. Obviously, it'll be at a slower pace because of the impacts that we've had, et cetera, but they'll be fine in terms of, nature and the planet and all that. It'll be fine completely. I think that for us, it's more so about the different scenarios into the future that we have. So I think it was the UN that they have a scenarios, business as usual, if we keep going the way that we're going, versus a 3-degree increase in climate and in temperature versus a 2-degree versus a 1.5 degree. And that's what the Paris Agreement is trying to do, to keep warmth, that temperature rise, minimum top 2 degrees increase. So if you look at those different scenarios, you can get a really good idea as to what the extent of those impacts are going to be into the future. So yeah, if we do keep our temperature range 1.5 degrees, the impacts in terms of climate are going to be, they'll still be bad, but they won't be as bad as, a 3-degree increase in temperature. And this is really important in particular for communities and countries that live like on the equator, because the people like up north from the north towards the North Poles and the southern end poles as well, they'll have impacts. But some now today, they say, oh great, like in Greenland, for instance, that's having huge climate change impacts, but they might say, oh great, we're gonna have a Caribbean tropical climate, that's gonna be great. But it's about, the people that are really on the front lines of climate change that are going to brunt the worst of those impacts. And I guess it comes back to the conversation that you were saying about, well, what's the point if we're still going to be impacted and we're still going to be brunting these negative, lifestyles and all that. I think that, and I come across this conversation with a lot of people that they're not climate deniers, because I don't know if I actually know any climate deniers. But for me, I guess it comes down to, are we going to build a better world or not? Whether we do have impacts or not. Like, and I remember this cartoon that I saw that I always kind of come back to if I am having a conversation with someone that says, what's the point? Or climate change has always been real, or it's always been happening because of geological changes and all that. And yeah, that's fine. But what are the benefits if it comes down when it comes down to it? What are the benefits of addressing climate change? We're going to have less pollution. We're going to have energy independence because our economy will be potentially completely dependent on renewables, for instance. We're going to have green jobs. We're going to have more livable cities, healthy children, cleaner air, more conservation practices across different ecosystems, whether that's forests or the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, won't die. So what is so wrong with that? Do you know what I mean? Like who cares if it's real or not? At the end of the day, we're building a better world for ourselves and for society. So whether it's a hoax, and I'm putting air quotes on that, it doesn't matter. It like at the end of the day, we're building a better world. So whether it's real or not, let's just do it. Let's just get on with it.
I've never framed it in that way. But what do we lose? Like, what are the negatives from trying to do this? I think that unfortunately the world we lived in is too tied into corporatocracies and capitalism. And so people are like, well, in my house, we like to have 2 cars and we don't want to give up a car, or we don't want to start riding bikes, even though we could. I feel like governments can only do so much, and it's going to be on individuals. But at the same time, I know that the corporate narrative for the longest of times with climate has been like, let's put it on the individuals, because then we don't have to suffer the actual causes. Like Exxon is known about climate change since the 70s, but they've done a really good campaign of like putting other things on the individual to, be more environmentally friendly. And I am so excited to ask you this next thing, because it's something I struggle with as somebody with a master's in international affairs. And throughout my study, and even now when I talk with people, it's the S word. And you've talked today about sustainability. So talk to me about the difference. And this is something we talked about earlier off mic, but break down the difference, because this is important, I think, for me to understand as well, is like, break down the difference between sustainable tourism and regenerative tourism. Or like, hey, I have my company and I come to you and I'm like, we think we're sustainable. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't, but what we want to be is regenerative. So break that down. And I am also thinking that I also want to ask you if the sustainable regenerative conversation goes back to the mitigation adaptation conversation, if those kind of have those changes in how we think about the future and the planet.
So going back to what you were saying first about, governments and corporations and the individual, something that I've learned through my master's was there's this, I don't know if I call it a tool or a framework or a methodology, but it's systems thinking. So it's about looking at the interconnections between systems. And I think people, you said, oh, we like to have 2 cars, but that's changing. Like, look at Uber. Uber is one of the most, I think it's probably the most popular, transportation company, and they don't even own cars. And the same with Airbnb as well. They don't own property. They depend on, what they call the sharing economy. So I think that's changing. But at the same time, here in Australia, for instance, I have the same problem that our transportation system here in Brisbane is shocking. Like it takes me 20 minutes to drive into work. If I were to catch a train, it'll be like an hour and a half. I don't have that kind of time to commute, 3 hours to work. So unfortunately, my hands are tied. I can't commute to work even if I wanted to, So when you think about it from a systems thinking perspective, you're realizing, well, there's a social system within me as an individual, and there's another political system when it comes to the Brisbane City Council and the infrastructure that they've built to facilitate to me as an individual to make the choice to use transportation, because it doesn't take me 3 hours a day to commute to work. So there's these intricacies between these different systems that people don't really think about. And I think it speaks to the notion, that kind of individualistic mentality that we have, that, we have our own world and our own house and our cars, and we don't really think about, well, how are my decisions impacting the wider system, but how is the wider system also impacting on my own decisions, and that's important to look at those interconnections. So that's one thing. And systems thinking is a way of looking at these social ecological systems across different systems. There's this concept of nested systems within systems. that you can look at it holistically and address these different challenges individually, but that when you address them, perhaps you address them individually, but there's this new emerging property that creates change. So that's one thing, and that's really important. The other thing that you were asking about, the difference between sustainability and regenerative, and if I have a client that comes and says, I think I'm sustainable, but I want to be regenerative. So you can look at sustainability as a spectrum. And the first thing that I'll do, actually, I'll define what sustainability is. So sustainability comes from, in the 80s, they created a Brundtland, it's called the Brundtland Report. And they taught, and the reason why they came together was to discuss sustainable development. So sustainability, the word sustainability comes from that kind of policy, international policy discussions on sustainable development. And in 1987, when they created the Brundtland Report, which is very, popular in the sustainability field, they defined sustainable development as sustainable development is development that doesn't impact, that allows the future generations to continue to thrive despite the fact of the actions that current generations do. So essentially, it's sustaining the current status quo into the future, so that whatever we do today, future generations don't have to brunt the impact of our actions today. So that's pretty much what the concept of sustainability is. It's sustaining that. So you can have a company that has net negative impact, or they have a lot of impact. Say, for example, mining companies, they have quite a bit of impact. So if you look at it from the lens of sustainability, a mining company, it's not sustainable because they continue to extract resources from the earth, and eventually, these resources aren't renewable, so eventually they'll cease to exist. So that's kind of like the end of the spectrum. And then you have companies, as you kind of move along, that they do isolated sustainability. So it might be things like corporate social responsibility. Then you have others that, as you move along, they might be looking at ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. So they might call themselves green companies. And then you have sustainable companies, which are balanced companies, and they, the outputs versus their inputs they balance themselves out. So they can, theoretically, they can maintain their operations into the future without, being in that balanced state. And then you have companies that are regenerative. And regeneration is about, you're not just maintaining that balance, you're actually giving back to the ecosystem or to society or to communities. And each company will have a different priority. And they can use different frameworks as well. Like if you look at the literature, there's so many different frameworks that you can implement in your business or your company to be regenerative or to be sustainable. And one of them that's quite popular now is the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the difference between sustainability and regeneration. It's about, sustainability maintains, regeneration is let's leave these places better than we found them, pretty much. And the reason why I think personally the conversation has evolved from sustainability to regeneration is because we realize that sustainability is not enough. We need to go beyond that and actually be proactive to get back to, to give net positive impacts to nature and to communities and society. And sustainability, unfortunately, is not going to allow us to do that because, like I said earlier, I think personally, I don't know if this is pessimistic, but I think we're too late. We need to start revolutionizing our systems to give back. And that's what regeneration is about.
Well, this is exactly, you teed me up for my next question because, and thank you so much for that breakdown because it was super helpful for me. And in my head, I could see this line and it's like, okay, mining companies, bad, Exxon, bad, extraction, bad. Then you have CSR. They're doing a little bit more. Then you have ESG. Then you have the sustainable, which is basically just breaking zero or net zero. And then you have, we're in the surplus of giving back to humanity. I think humanity, because humanity. Without the planet, humanity does die. Without certain temperatures, we're not going to do well, which is regeneration. So you're saying maybe we're too late. If you were, and I don't know really who runs the world when it comes to this stuff, and maybe you can tell me who you would be to change these things. But part of me is like, you're either going to be the head of the European Union, you're going to be the head of the UN, you're going to be the president of the United States, or maybe, a president or a world leader. If it were up to you, what do you do day one tomorrow to make things regenerative? And I know I'm looking at your face. This is not an easy question, but I feel like in order to solve, this is going to be cheesy, but in order to solve the nightmare that climate crisis is becoming every day, we almost have to dream our way out of it. And so come up with ridiculous ideas and say, yeah, that's ridiculous. And maybe we don't get there, but if we get 45% of the way there, we're way better than if we did nothing.
Yes, 100%. And yeah, I was laughing because going back to that conversation of systems thinking, there's so much that can be done. But I don't know, I consider myself a bit of a conservationist. So I think that I would focus on regenerating nature, whether that's go and plant 100 billion trees across the world. I'm not sure what the right number would be, but trees are awesome. Like people talk about carbon capture technology and all that. And it's like, dude, the tree in your yard is a carbon capture technology, So I think I would focus on that. But I think that's a very simplistic answer, to be honest. There's so many different ways of tackling the problem. And actually, even before I went, with the tree thing, I'd probably surround myself with experts in each of these different industries that can give me insight on how to tackle, how do we build transportation more sustainably? How do we revolutionize our energy system worldwide? All these technologies, because obviously I'm not an expert in each of those different fields. But I will leave you with something. There's a really good documentary called 2040. It's by an Australian producer. And it's the only documentary that I've seen that kind of ties into what you said about we have to have the courage to dream. And he frames it that way. So the entire documentary is about, he presents an image, he imagines a world by 2040 if we decided to implement all the technologies that we currently have, because we do have the technology, and this is the thing, like it's out there. So he frames the documentary as in, if we were to use all the technology that we have available, what would 2040 look like? And it's super inspiring, and it completely kind of detours from the doom and gloom of climate change that is so prominent in the media that, I triggers my eco grief, to be completely honest. So yeah, I think that would be a really good documentary for you to watch that will help you, imagine a better world and what's possible by 2040 if we were to have the political will to implement those changes.
Oh, for sure. Check it out. There's a plethora of documentaries out there. And I think the one I recently rewatched it. I had COVID. I got COVID over Christmas, from Christmas, and I was just doing nothing for a while. So I recently rewatched it, but it's the one that Leonardo DiCaprio did, The Time of the Flood. Something like that.
What is it?
The flood is here.
Something of floods. Yeah, I remember the word floods.
The word flood. Yeah, I should look it up. I should know this, but he does a really good job in his documentary because it's totally the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future, where he says, this is where we came from, this is where we are, and then this is where we're going. But
before the flood.
Thank you so much. And I think that that's a really great way of doing it, because focusing on the positive is what we should do when we're trying to solve any problem, not just climate crisis. It could be anything, even on our individual micro level. But I do agree with you. Eco grief is real. And I've told you, I'm trying to do more podcasts, do more episodes about climate, talk to people like you who are around the world, who are on the forefront of this, because I think it's really important. But I keep getting dragged back into blockchain and cryptocurrency strictly just because it's more optimistic, it's new, it's fun. People are a little bit more excited, and there isn't crypto grief, right? But there is such thing as eco grief. I mean, there is if you lose a lot of money, I'm sure, but eco grief is a very real thing. And I know that many people in our generation, I feel like we're slammed between two interesting generations. We have the baby boomers that are behind us, which have kind of left us with this world. And I don't want to blame it on them, but
they had their hand in it. And then we have this new generation that's in front of us. And in many ways, it's going to be us, up to our generation, millennials, and the generation in front of us, to probably make a lot of lifestyle changes and sacrifices, knowing that we may never reap the rewards. And I think that that is the most altruistic thing that there is, knowing that maybe it's not our children, but our children's children who will reap the benefits of our actions. And one of the things I actually more specifically wanted to ask you about was your tree idea, because I think that complex problems can have really simple solutions. And my question is, and I'm just so curious to hear your answer on this. I am currently up in Massachusetts, so I'm closer to the pole than people who are on the equator. And I wonder, is there better places? Am I better off planting a tree here, or in Colombia when I'm on the equator, or in mid Atlantic, the United States, maybe like North Carolina? Are there places on the planet that is better for carbon capture than others? And the reason why I say this is because the Amazon is currently being cut down at an alarming rate. So can I, as someone up in Massachusetts, offset that by planting a tree, or does it really need to be in the Amazon?
I think that the benefits of planting trees anywhere is beneficial, like are valuable, those benefits. Obviously, in places like the Amazon, which is already, the lungs of the planet, planting more trees would have a bigger impact. So there's that concept of leverage. And there's an architecture that builds a city in Brazil, actually, speaking of the Amazon, that he calls them acupuncture points. So it's points in the system where you can enact a change that will have a ripple effect across the entire system. And when you have, ecosystems such as rainforests, obviously the ripple effect of planting, of reforesting rainforests will be significantly higher than if you were to plant a tree in Massachusetts, for instance. In saying that, though, planting trees in Massachusetts also helps reduce the heat index of cities, which in a changing climate will help people, especially the elderly, have, less strokes, for example, and just purify the air as well, especially because in our cities we have cars that pollute the air. So I think they each have their own merit, but if we wanted to kind of capitalize on the benefits, then I do believe that it's better to focus on areas that are already naturally forests.
And this question comes because I'm just so curious and I don't know. And this is why I kind of love podcasting, because I get to meet people from around the world and just kind of pick their brains. So what are the conversations and what are the climate crisis effects that are most impactful right now, probably negatively to Australia?
I think the bushfires, because we started 2020, pretty much almost the entire country burning. So since then, that's been really front of mind of people. And it's interesting as well, because there was a report done I believe it was in the 90s, that was saying that by 2020, Australia will be dealing with large scale bushfires. And if you read the data, the science, and you compare it with 2020, it's almost like a Nostradamus prediction. It's creepy. So I think the bushfires is really top of mind of people. We do get a lot of floods here as well, which when you think about Australia being the driest continent in the world, it's quite an oxymoron, because we have these different extremes. And the reef, the Great Barrier Reef as well. There's a lot of talk about us losing the reef, and by 2050, we've had mass bleaching events consecutively the last 3 years. This year, because it's a La Nina year, we haven't had that much. We haven't had any bleaching actually this year, or if we have, they haven't read it in the news. So yeah, I think those are the three kind of main issues that are front of mind for people. The government itself has a lot of, I guess, resilience plans for the coast, because most of the population is on the eastern coast of Australia. And obviously there's, sea level rise and things like that. So I think for people, it's potentially there's a difference between what people value versus what the government values, but both of them are important.
Wait, if you could speak more about that. What is the government valuing that the people don't value? And then what do the people value that maybe the government doesn't?
The government right now, we have the Liberal Party, which people get confused, and I got confused as well when I moved here, because in the States, liberal is, Democrats and a little bit more kind of left leaning, if you want to use that terminology. Whereas here it's the opposite. So Labor is the more left leaning, and then you have the Greens, which are quite left in the spectrum. But the Liberal Party that we currently have in power, Scott Morrison is his name, the Prime Minister, they're quite conservative. It's the typical kind of mentality of, climate change is important, but, So the last election here was, a lot of people dubbed it the climate election, because it was the last election that, well, not the last election, I'm not going to be that pessimistic, but it was just a very important election that was going to kind of dictate where we were heading in terms of climate change and all that. And it didn't happen because of other political reasons and parties supporting, help lobbying people and using certain tactics and stuff that I won't get into it, but we're a little bit unethical. So the government, they do, in a sense, they do acknowledge, but it's not top of mind. I think that there's been a lot of change in Australia in terms of the policy talks for, when Julia Gillard was in power, there was talk about a carbon tax, and it for all intents and purposes, it seems like there was a lot of kind of progress in the field, and then the carbon tax got scrapped. And since then, the Australian Climate Coalition I got abolished with this government too. So it's almost like sometimes I feel like, and I guess it goes back into the whole eco-grief conversation, it feels sometimes that you take one step forward, two steps back. There has been a lot of talk now, especially in South Australia, with renewables, because South Australia had an issue with, I can't remember what the background of it was, but there was maybe a blackout, I want to say. I can't remember what triggered it, but they ended up bringing in Tesla and Elon Musk, and now they're building their infrastructure pretty much all renewables with, battery storage and all that. So that's positive in South Australia. And the other thing is as well that the way that the government is kind of structured here, and I'm sure it's the same potentially in the States, is that you have the federal government and then you have the state governments, and each one have their own different policies and their own different laws. Like, say, for example, in Canberra, growing your own cannabis is legal, whereas in other states it's not. So there's kind of complexities within that as well. And people here, I think when it comes to climate, there's a bit of an emotional aspect of it with our farmers as well, because there's, Australia depends a lot on farmers and droughts, for instance. Like, I remember when the bushfires happened, and even before that as well, there was photos of, farmers, their cows and, their flock. Is it called a flock or cattle or their sheep?
The herd, the cattle,
Yeah.
cattle, there you go.
Yeah, dying, and like the suicide rates in farmers is one of the highest here in Australia. And it ties into climate and the impacts of climate change as well. So I guess those are the different things. I'm sure that there's more to talk about more in depth, but I'm not too across the policy of things in the government.
You mentioned Elon Musk, and I was thinking about whether to bring this up because I saw this quote and I saw him speak. He was at some fossil fuel conference. It was about energy, and they had him there, and I'm not sure if he was there to just try to kind of be annoying and be like, hey, I'm trying to only use electric. And, I am the death of you guys here in this room here. But he was asked point blank, if he could, would he turn off fossil fuels the next day if it were up to him, hypothetically? And he said no, because he said our world is so dependent upon them. If I did that, there would be catastrophe, deaths, millions, riots. I mean, overnight, imagine if ATMs couldn't work in much of the world that is still uses cash. I mean, it would be bedlam. So understanding that, how do you think we as a human society get away from fossil fuels? Like, how gradual does that look? How many years, if we started tomorrow, how long would it take?
Well, I think that I wouldn't turn the fossil fuel industry off either, which kind of feels a little bit almost like betrayal to say that, but it's true. People depend on it, and like, look at India and China. They shutting off a complete economic system that puts people's livelihoods in danger. So I think there's something to be said about being realistic in that sense. And even though I'm optimistic and I'm all for, building renewables and all that, and I'm against fossil fuels, unfortunately, that's the system that we've built, and it's all we've got at the moment. So I think that there's kind of two sides to the whole transitioning conversation, and it has to do first with political will. So governments have to be able and willing to subsidize the transition to renewables and realize as well that there's a massive investment, in terms of return on investment to do that. Like the renewable energy sector is like trillions of dollars, to be made. Obviously, we've had issues with the technology, but the reason why we've had issues with the technology is because there hasn't been that many investments towards renewables. So now it's starting to come down in terms of prices. And even the fossil fuel industry is realizing that. Like Shell here recently bought a renewable energy company called PowerShop. And they didn't build, I think what they bought was the retail arm of it, but they're realizing, it's happening. It's inevitable. It's going to be up to us as individuals to demand it. Like, for example, I have solar panels at home, and my energy provider is PowerShop. And now I'm switching because they just got bought by Shell. And yeah, it's great that you're starting to realize as Shell, the value in investment in renewables and all that, but you've been a climate wrecker for the past 50 years. So I don't feel as a human being, my values, I don't feel good about supporting a company that's been bought by Shell. So now I'm switching to this company called Enova, and it's a community solar energy company. So we have choices as individuals, number one. And as we make those choices, it signals to the market what needs to happen. And whether government acknowledges it or not, business is listening. And so there's something to be said about the power of business as well. Because, yeah, government is great and all, but, we live in a free market. So business also has immense amount of power to change things too. And here, when it comes to renewables specifically that you were talking about, every day there's companies, renewable companies popping up. And this one in particular, Enova, is a community, just solely community managed. And that's why I love it. That's why I support it. And there's something to be said as well about the government. Like, for example, in Bangladesh, they have these, and you'll see it in the 2040 documentary, they have these solar grid that gets shared across different communities. So say, for example, if you and I are neighbors and I have solar panels, when the sun is shining, instead of me putting the energy back into the general grid, I'll put it so that you can receive electricity. And then if you have solar panels as well, then all the houses are connected and the energy is shared amongst them. But that's illegal here in Australia. You can't do that.
It's illegal here in the States too. You can't even in many places. And I think I may be speaking out of term, but the last time I checked, because we have solar panels here at the house and many of my friends do, you can't even save your own energy. That's illegal. Is it the same in Australia where you can't have a battery pack to save it?
It's not illegal here. And I don't know I know that it's not illegal in South Australia because they have that storage project, but I don't know if in Queensland it is or it isn't, because again, each state will have a different rules. But we do put energy back into the grid, and I get credited to my electricity bill. So I pay last time I think I paid $16 for my energy, for my electricity bill. So you can put power back into the grid. I'm not sure if you can store it. I would think so, because I know that there's companies here that sell storage, like batteries to store energy. They're expensive, but I don't know. That's something I'm going to check that out actually, because I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that you can't do that here, because I remember having that conversation with some people. I think that is going to change. And I know Tesla is trying to make all these batteries and basically have every house just kind of be its own thing, which is going to be a complete change in the way the fossil fuel industry kind of runs, especially up here where a lot of people use gas. I mean, that's what we need. It gets so cold. That's how we heat the house. And so looking ahead, regenerative tourism, INTEGO travel is that the best place for people to reach out if they want to get in contact with you? I know we got in contact through LinkedIn, but if somebody says, you know what, I really want to hit up Vanessa, I want to know what's going on. I'm also in the sustainable travel or regenerative travel space. Where's the best place for people to get in touch with you?
So I'm usually on LinkedIn as Vanessa Taveras Dalmau. I'm also on Instagram, and my handle it's Vanessa Angelina. Angelina is my middle name. And yeah, they can also reach out to me through the website, so integotravel.com. And I'm in the process of building my consulting business, which is integoconsulting.com. So those are all the different ways.
Very cool. Well, thank you for coming on and talking some climate. And it is nighttime here, but I know it's midday there. So I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Jarrett. Thanks so much for coming to me. It was very cool to talk.
Absolutely. Ciao.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode, and a big thanks to Vanessa for joining the pod. I wrote her actually tonight as I was putting the pod together, and I wanted to ask her her opinion on the episode's artwork and the title and make sure that everything looked good. And she responded that she's been dealing with flooding nearly since we recorded almost 3 nights ago. So Vanessa, I hope you're well, and I'm sending you my best. And I don't think that there could be any more of an ironic response from her, as this episode is dedicated to the climate crisis. To follow up with Vanessa, find her on Instagram at It's Vanessa Angelina or via her website at INTEGO Travel. That's INTEGO Travel. Please follow us on whatever social media account you use at Wi-Fi and Water Podcast, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review on whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to us on. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, colleague, or family member via text or an email. That's right, just drop a link in a text and say, hey, check this out. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.